Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. This is Dylan in the host chair again, taking the Wayback Machine for a little bit of a wild adventure. This is going to be kind of one of our wackier episodes. Full disclosure, Chris and Evan, who are both here. Chris.
Hi, good people.
Yep, there's the magic words. Evan, say hello to everybody.
Hey, guys. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
Full disclosure, this is the third episode in a 3-episode recording marathon we're doing. So this was already going to be kind of wacky. I have no idea what's about to happen.
I think we're going to be a little bit recording giddy by the end of this. So all the wackiness is going to come out.
And this is kind of the topic for it, because this is going to be sort of an outrageous little experiment we have here. So to keep a short background, I have been re-listening to the audiobook of Napoleon's Hemorrhoids by Phil Mason, which highly recommend and everybody pick up or listen to in either book or audiobook form. It's a great book. It's kind of one of those, like, a lot of not really big chapters, a bunch of little factoids about a bunch of stuff, but it's giving me all these good ideas for alternate history scenarios, like the one that we're going to talk about now. So picture, if you will, 1786. A young nation has just been founded, the United States of America. Their governing document, the Articles of Confederation, has profoundly screwed things up. They just barely have beaten Britain with the help of the French. They just barely have beaten a bunch of retired soldiers drunk on whiskey who haven't been paid in 8 months. Shays Rebellion, for anybody who's keeping track. And they start to realize, hey, maybe we need to revise this. Maybe we need to do a sort of a 2.0, if you will, see if we can do this kind of better the second time around. In 1786, there's all this talk about how the problems of the Articles of Confederation are making issues, and there's talk of the next year convening a constitutional convention to develop a new form of government. In the middle of all this, the former president of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, Nathaniel Gorham, along with some other people you may have heard of, everybody's favorite rap musical subject, Hamilton, a future president and founder of the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe. All of these guys, this sort of cadre of future founding fathers and Federalists, come up with an idea. Hey, maybe what we need is a king. It's not like we just spent 6 years fighting one off. Maybe we should think about maybe, a strong figure is a guiding hand is really kind of necessary in the midst of all this. So they send a letter, supposedly. This is all very apocryphal. I've got to put that on the front end. Supposedly, they send a letter through Baron von Steuben, the guy who basically completely organized the Continental Army on the Prussian model in the Revolutionary War. They send this letter via von Steuben to Prince Henry of Prussia, who is the younger brother of Frederick the Great, the man who basically put Prussia on the map in terms of a military and sort of set the foundation for, the Prussia of the 1800s leading into the foundation of the German Empire. In our timeline, Henry may or may not have gotten this letter. It looks like he actually did now, and kind of didn't do anything with it. He just sort of sat on it, didn't react, didn't do anything. And by the time 1787, May of the next year rolls around, everybody is very, they're republic all the way. We're not going to have a king. And the Constitutional Convention comes up with the Constitution as we know it. However, what if Henry had said yes, is our fork? So the idea is they send the letter. What if Henry, instead of saying, no, I'm not really interested, or just kind of, sitting on the fence about it, what if he says, yeah, that sounds great. My brother's a bully. I've been living in his shadow for 30 years. I've been his greatest general and one of his greatest diplomats for years. And what do I have to show for it? Nothing. Sure, I'll take a kingdom, even if it's in this backwater America halfway across the world. That'll be my legacy. So what if Henry shows up in 1787? That's our fork. What does an American monarchy end up looking like? And I just want to say, this is not the first time that Henry had actually tried to get a kingdom. He had been a diplomat. He'd been a Prussian ambassador to Russia with Catherine the Great. He'd actually been involved in several schemes trying to get his own kingdom, either the King of Poland or this like Wallachian state that Catherine the Great was going to set up in Eastern Europe. And this is not the first time that Americans had made noises about getting a king. In 1782, there was a letter when the Continental Army was posted up in New York that basically made the rounds in response to the fact that the army hadn't been paid by Congress, that said, hey, maybe we should have a coup d'etat. Maybe we should have the generals take over. While this letter is going on, another guy who's at this camp in Newburgh, New York, sends a letter to Washington that says, hey, do you want to be our king? So this is a thing that, at least as of this time, is more than we would think in the sort of national political discussion. Chris, I was about to open it up. What you got?
Oh yeah, people, and I'm going to say, throw it to Dylan a little bit, but Evan as well. People that tried to avoid math in college and studied American legislative and political philosophy and history, you read John Locke, you read Rousseau, and I mean, those aren't necessarily Republican tracts. They talk about a social contract. They talk about division of authority, but none of them really explicitly do away with the idea of a monarchy. And
Thomas Hobbes as well. He was very monarchical in his outlook. And he, if I remember correctly, supported the divine right of kings. Mm-hmm. So that, and he was an influence on the founders as well.
And, to kind of really make it interesting, not so much the British ruling family at this point, but the previous ruling family, William and Mary type, they had originally been of Orange of the Netherlands, which was a stadtholder republic where you had a series of Habsburg provinces that revolted, created a little bit of a representative government, but still decided we still want to have a king, and that's who they brought in. So there was a bit of a
And to even bring it back to the people we're talking about, Voltaire, the guy who basically came up with this whole Enlightenment idea of a philosopher king, said that Frederick the Great was basically the closest any king had ever come to embodying this ideal. But if you compare Frederick to Henry in terms of pure accomplishments, Henry is probably the one who would have actually been this Enlightenment philosopher king. So it presents this kind of interesting idea of, kind of the perfect storm of, okay, this is the one time when America might have entertained us. And also, this is the one guy that they could have sold people on in terms of actually being the king.
I would agree with that. And I think a big part of that is because America, of course, obviously had very entrenched anti-British sentiments. And as we were noting in the pre-discussion leading up to this podcast, Prussia and Britain are not exactly in the midst of a bromance at this point in time of history. They were, they fought alongside each other in the 7 Years' War, but, Prussia kind of felt slighted by Britain. And, as I think it was Dylan who mentioned this, that Britain was basically going to fight to the last Prussian. They didn't really care too much about what happened to them. And so Prussia felt slighted by them. And so there was already, from all of our points of view, a fairly well-established link that could have happened based on a shared me-no-likey Britain that would have made this plausible.
One of the really interesting things, to kind of we are on a 3-episode set. Maybe an hour and a half ago, we were recording the episode of 1876, and we talked about, in American history, you learned Abraham Lincoln and then World War I. in American history, you learned the French and Indian War. That's the 70 Years' War he just got done talking about. And one of the interesting links of this is the reason that the conflict between Britain and Prussia was because Britain's role in that war in Europe was to just throw money at the Prussians to keep fighting. They actually did, fighting in India and in, North America and all outside of Europe. But in the European war, their role was just the paymaster of the Prussian war effort. They spent themselves into debt that led to what we are talking about right now.
What we're talking about now.
Exactly.
Having to raise the price of tea a couple pennies kind of ticked off a few backwater Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah. So something that immediately came to my mind, and because I'm looking at Dylan's very extensive document here outlining his thoughts on this, but just the main thought that I think I'll bring to this discussion is, how would this have affected the balance of power in France? So, we have the ideas of Voltaire, the philosopher king, and all of this, but we also have very anti-monarchical, pro-republican, pro-different set of government sort of philosophies starting to circulate in France. And France supported, the Americans very famously in the American Revolution, primarily as a way, again, to get back at Britain, their age-old enemy. So my immediate thought on this is, if America establishes a monarchy, even if it's, which I'm sure we'll get into details of later on in this episode, but even if it's like a very limited monarchy, even if it's, checks and balances, yada, 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 I think the idea of, this Prussian king coming over and taking over America, when France just spent, 7 years in the 7 Years' War fighting the combined British and Prussian forces, I think would have really made them pretty upset. And to that end, the French Revolution was kind of a realization of a lot of these Enlightenment ideas, of this anti-monarchical sentiment, kicking out, what was it, Louis the 16th, I think it was, yeah. And Marie Antoinette of, let them eat cake fame.
We may have an episode coming up about, by the way.
Which we do have an episode on that. So preview of coming attractions. So if we have this all going on, we have, and, Thomas Jefferson, for example, was very famously, French sympathetic, very sympathetic to the French cause, very sympathetic to what was going on with the French Revolution. And the Federalists were, kind of more, older school, sort of mindset. This, I think, would have a very interesting effect on and how France would respond, because France, I think, would have taken a step back and been like, hold up, we just helped you guys win your independence, and now you're going back to somebody that we spent 7 years fighting. I think, the French-American bromance would have been over a lot sooner. And as I say that, I haven't thought about the full implications of that. How this affects the French Revolution. I personally feel, just as I'm spitballing it right now, the French Revolution probably would have happened, as an even more, it's like kind of like when you have, this group mentality of like the world is against me sort of thing. It's like France would be like, okay, wait, we got Britain, we got Prussia, now we got America becoming a monarchy. Everybody's kind of against us. Like America kind of backtracked on the idea, the reason why we supported them to begin with. So this could have led to an even, I guess, I don't know how to say it, earlier, harsher, whatever, sort of French uprising against this whole idea of monarchy, because they're like, you know what, everybody is, going against our ideals. So let's set up shop here.
So I teased it off, and I'm gonna go ahead and do what I always do and talk about Bismarck.
Yes. Yes.
I wasn't sure if on Metternich or Bismarck was going to come up first, but I knew one of them was going to show up.
Knew this was coming. So I think, all right, take a step back, talk about Franco-Prussian War. We're talking about Prussia becoming an important German state. The end of that process, led by Bismarck, when they actually unify all of Germany, was triggered by the Franco-Prussian War, which was started because basically Bismarck tricked the French into getting offended about one of their royals not being selected for an open seat, for an open throne. And, I feel, Evan, the one thing I'm thinking about when you talk about that is you are still personifying France as Republican France. It's still Bourbon.
It is still right.
And I kind of have the opinion that a Bourbon France gets really offended and might even do almost exactly what they did 100 years hence
later. Yeah.
And might go to war over a Bourbon not being chosen for the American throne. By the way, let's pause. What happens at the end of the Franco-Prussian War? French Commune. Or Paris Commune, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and let's not forget that the quasi-war in the Adams administration is only 10 years removed from this. So it is not at all an unreasonable thing to think that the U.S. and France had the bromance not been bromancy, they could have gone at it.
Yeah.
Even
100%.
without a diplomatic, effrontery to the king situation, just purely on economics alone, they could have gone.
So
War of 1812, then, I think this still doesn't even happen, right? Because Britain's going to get them back.
Oh, there's so much before we get to that.
A Kings War or something like that?
A lot.
We got to get dramatic names.
I mean, the first question is, what do we think a Bourbon, how is a Hohenzollern American monarch going to sit with Bourbon France? That's the question.
Well, I think first we've got to figure out how a Hohenzollern American monarch is going to sit, period. Because we haven't even gotten in terms of what powers they have. Mm-hmm. And I think that is going to get at a whole lot of the posturing that, continental Europe sees in terms of these Americans. Because you got to, today we think of America as America. Mm-hmm. But even in the late 1800s, America was for the most part seen as, other than maybe in an industrial and resource, perspective, they were seen as basically a complete backwater. Mm-hmm. This is where all the rednecks go. They had sent all the convicts to Australia, but
there's the Bass Pro
they wanted to get rid of.
There's the Bass Pro reference.
No, not the Bass Pro reference. So basically, what we're saying is King Henry's
I may pause.
A throne is going to be in the Bass Pro shop in Memphis.
We are recording right after the King Tut episode, which you need to listen to the end of.
You need to listen to the end of that in order to get what just happened.
Anyway, moving on. I think the question, there is a question of, because continental Europe is going to react to what they're going to perceive as a backwater American state. They're not going to take it terribly seriously, especially if, depending on what the parameters of King Henry's rule. So I think
that's a really interesting point that
the government.
In the previous episode, I was talking, or what I was just talking about, it take the agency of the rule completely out of it. It is literally just how they're playing games of who they're going to put on this throne, and it does completely ignore what the Americans want to do with the situation.
Yeah. Because I think you have to remember that this is when we're drafting our Constitution. So there's going to be a way, and this is even if we had a constitutional monarchy, it's going to be very different from a sort of British constitutional monarchy, because the Brits don't have a written constitution. Everything's common law based. It's, it goes back to the Magna Carta, but it's all this kind of like jumble of like 800 different documents. And this one guy said this one thing 200 years ago and everybody kind of went along with it. Whereas the Americans are about to enter into a much more, codified, written down structure of government. So just real quickly, here's kind of what I'm thinking, and we don't have to go into it a ton, because I don't think all that much would be different. I think the legislature is not going to change much in terms of the structure wise. I think you're
probably just different names, like could be Parliament, House
yeah,
of
that
maybe, kind of thing.
Even some of that maybe, because I think there would probably be a resistance to a certain level of aristocracy in America.
Yeah,
setting aside a king, there's not a tradition of entrenched nobility. So yeah, the names are about as much as I would expect to change, but I still think you're going to get a kind of bicameral situation to compromise between bigger states and smaller states, and all the regional differences that we're dealing with. Because just because you have a king doesn't mean he's magically going to hold this all together. They've still got to do all of that. The executive is kind of an interesting. I don't know that it would be a president, purely because at the time a president was seen as one who presides, the literal root of the word. Whereas here, I think you would see, at least I think you would see, a president, or maybe either a chancellor, or even something like a governor general title, much more with much more emphasis on the general part.
That's what I would think.
As sort of a counter, because Henry is a very accomplished military commander. So that's good, but that's also bad when you've just fought off Mad King George. So the executive as sort of the commander in chief, as a bulwark against the crown, is more sort of where I envision it. And then I wonder if
previous reference, I kind of like stadtholder.
Yeah.
It communicates the holder of the state.
Or even, to throw a not so subtle reference against the crown, a Lord Protector. I wonder if the sort of civil, president figure is more on the commander in chief side. I imagine the king, because they have to give him something, maybe give him more of the sort of like, meeting foreign dignitaries and sort of the foreign policy stuff, with the whole, treaties still have to be ratified and all that. To give him more of, he's sort of the foreign policy face of the United States. And then the judiciary is the one that I think is really interesting, because at least from the English perspective, the modern English judiciary derives from the fact that the king had too much land to deal with and could not personally hear all of the issues that needed to be adjudicated, which is how it happened for, basically all of time. Is the king would either hear stuff himself, or he would designate somebody to do that for him. And so I think that's where the king might take most of the authority, something like either instead of, or like a higher position over, like the Supreme Court, something like that. That's kind of vague ideas.
Here's a question I have, which comes to mind. So you're saying the king, the stadtholder, the Lord Protector, I love that, is going to take over kind of the executive function. But, we haven't talked about this, but is this executive going to be, what is the succession plan?
Well,
how do we pick the next one?
Well, and so that's the part that's really kind of interesting. One, succession of the monarchy itself, and also succession of the executive. Because I think the judiciary and the legislature, that's going to be what it's going to be. I don't think there's much change. I wonder if you would, like the sort of Lord Protector, Governor General, I wonder if it's going to be elected, out of the governors of the various states.
Okay.
As a pool, or maybe there's
so almost like an EU, like a count, like the
kind of sort of, or like a combination pool presented to the king.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then
I was still
veto if
thinking
it's like too outrageous or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that that would be if we're envisioning the post as being something that's complementing the king in his role versus being more of like a check and balance. Based on how you were describing it, Dylan, it was kind of like more of a king is foreign policy mainly and has, that power and is really like the head of state, all that kind of thing. But then we have this person that's appointed who is either elected or appointed who like manages a lot of the domestic affairs. I personally feel like if we're going to give the monarchy, at least some degree of power and influence, because, again, we're dealing with the schools of thought among the founders of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And in our timeline, the, slightly more, central government power inclined Federalists ended up carrying the day. I honestly think that post could be just straight up appointed by the monarch. And this could lead to some interesting conflicts of interest down the road, where you have the governor general or the Lord Protector on the one hand saying to the king, hey, I think this is how things should be done, or I want to do things this way, and the king wants things done another way. That could be interesting. But you also would assume that if it's the king who's appointing this guy, that they're going to be a lot more in lockstep with what the king is doing. So I don't know. But if we also want to follow the whole European monarch sort of idea where they're kind of, we got the Atlantic Ocean, an ocean away. Newsflash, Prussia doesn't have a navy to speak of. Like this could be a situation where Henry would be more than content to rule an ocean away, or close, not really like on the ground, have his governor general be the main point of contact who's operating affairs. And he's the guy who's, fighting wars or putting out fires back over in Europe.
Well, I'm a little interested right now, so we understand what we're talking about. I was envisioning these being the same person.
You mean like a king and a Lord Protector is the same person?
Yes.
Okay. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that either, but that's a possibility.
My initial reaction was so much gut instinct against the possibility of both of those in the same person, just because of what happened with King George and all of that. But I mean,
if it is circumscribed so much that this person is in charge of unifying the nation, as almost like the British monarchy has become as a figurehead.
Exactly.
They don't, and it's written in that they do not have legislative powers. This is, because if you think about Articles of Confederation, the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that each state was off doing its own thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the change is that this person is, by the way, maybe this is kind of thinking about what you were talking about with a change to the judicial, which doesn't even come until later. Maybe this is the person responsible for settling disputes between states.
That's actually fascinating because let's not forget that the Supreme Court itself in our timeline did not really have anything going for it until Marbury versus Madison. And even after Marbury versus Madison. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I would argue that the Supreme Court doesn't actually have anything to do right now. They just gave themselves something to do and everyone went along with it.
And everyone went along with it because, you got Marbury versus Madison, which that's a whole nother funny sideshow story of what happened with that court case that is too much to get into right now. But basically, the Supreme Court asserted itself in Marbury versus Madison. And then you fast forward to Andrew Jackson, and he was basically like, all right, Supreme Court, you told me that I can't go into Indian land. Why don't you enforce that nice little pretty piece of paper that you just signed?
Yeah.
And
why don't you
nothing happened, right?
Oh, something happened.
Well, something happened, just not what the Supreme Court said should happen. Not what the Supreme Court wanted. So, just this idea of having a much different understanding of the relationship between the judiciary and the executive. That's a fascinating road to possibly travel for sure.
Yeah, I actually I do think there would be a stronger executive, whether that's two people or one person. I think at the very least you would have, a stronger, sort of executive function in terms of lawmaking or a court function. Maybe the king is Lord Protector, and then there's like a chancellor who is essentially the vice presidential function who does more of the administering. I don't know. But it's interesting to do that. But basically, we're at least mostly on the same page. Some questions of the executive aside, what this government kind of looks like. It's really not that much different functionally from ours. It's just once you get to the actual mechanics of different states versus each other, and
except for how we choose this executive.
Yes, and so that gets to kind of I don't want to avoid the French question. But
well, actually, let's just finish. Let's keep going on what this does to the American political structure. And if we're interested, we haven't done a two-parter in a bit.
A two-parter in a while.
Yeah.
Actually, I was going to say this is a good possible, two-parter arc.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll plan on doing like just sort of a early sort of American structure in like kind of early American years, and then we can come back and see.
Yeah.
Because we're going to touch on foreign policy stuff, and maybe we go into it. I guess there's one more big structural question, and that kind of gets into sort of the longer term is what does the succession look like? And there's a reason why I bring this up specifically with Henry is Henry never had any children. It was actually widely known that he was, he preferred the company of men to women. Also, Frederick the Great, same thing. Not quite as openly admitted to, but everybody, like, it was kind of an open secret. It was kind of like in Washington, everybody wonders how scandals don't get out. And it's kind of one of those things. It's like, yeah, everybody knows about it, so nobody talks about it. Kind of a deal. So in a situation specifically because we have to deal with it where the king has no heirs from the male, the morganatic line, so to speak, do we have an elective monarchy?
I mean,
how does that work?
I think you do that anyway. I think the United States, I think the constitutional founders set that up anyway because
to
getting
avoid
that
dynastic.
to avoid
we just fought a
power.
revolution against dynastic kingship. And so I was going to say, like, the famous thing that we like to go down here on A Fork in Time is the whole cousin jump thing, right? But here I really don't think there's an appetite for that. And the thing is that it's kind of pre-built into who Henry already is, and he doesn't have any heirs. So I think this just makes it incredibly natural.
I'm interested in the idea that, thinking at the history that people understood at this point, maybe that is even codified. That you get one, your genes get one shot. Because I'm thinking about what happened. Yeah, because I'm thinking about what happened in the Holy Roman Empire, where the emperor was
problem
was theoretically every single Holy Roman emperor was elected by the stakeholders.
Yeah,
and it got to the point that one family dominated that. And I think thinking about the United States and the founders, that is something they didn't want to happen. So maybe codifying that you cannot be the progeny of the previous executive.
Well, and that's really fascinating to think, because here's the thing: the Holy Roman Empire, is honestly completely oxymoronic in its title, because it was not holy, it wasn't Roman, and it certainly was not an empire. And
they elected their executive.
They elected their executive. So here's the thing: we're talking about an America in our timeline today that is heavily influenced by, Greek ideas on democracy, ancient Greek ideas on democracy, Roman ideas, British and French philosophers. This is basically an America that not only steals a king from modern Germany, but they'll take their governmental philosophy from Germany as well, which I think just fits like an absolute glove.
You know what? Actually, go next door. Go next door. And this is something most Americans don't even think about. The Polish kings were all elected.
See Henry's attempt to become king of Poland.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And here's another aspect to this that might be attractive in terms of a foreign policy aspect. Now you have a king who is ostensibly, or an emperor, whatever you want to call him, ostensibly he's on the same level, at least at the beginning, because he's in the same pool as all the kings of Europe. So why not use that as a tool to play off the different European powers, depending on what era you're in? Depending on what the geopolitical stage is in Europe in any given couple of decades, that's who you decide your monarchic election based off of.
And I'm really interested in that. That's really interesting because two thoughts I have. One is, do they say this person has to be a European royal, or do we have, let's fast forward 150 years, like do we have J.P. Morgan selected as?
And that's the question is, who do we have? Again, is it like a pool of the governors as sort of like elector princes almost?
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that goes through my mind is, what does that do? Because when did R. Henry die?
1802. Yeah,
1802. Mm-hmm. So, listen, we talked about what we're going to talk. We're going to address this later on a future episode. It's really interesting that in 1802, if I am a governor in the United States, it adds this really interesting dynamic of trying to pick the ascendant family in Europe. I'm picking like a Bonaparte.
Well, so actually, that's one of the interesting things is if you have a monarch in America, you don't have the natural born citizen clause, probably.
No, and I was thinking about that
Which
too.
Means
exactly.
Yeah.
They can invite a certain Corsican general who's kicking butt all over France in defense of the
one thing I feel like maybe not. I will say is I feel like what they're going to say is maybe not a born American. Maybe I do feel like they'll say not a monarch of another polity. So these are the second sons. These are
actually. So here's an idea. Philip Égalité,
mm-hmm.
the brother of Napoleon XVI, who was a big friend of the Revolution. Just for example, like this is the kind of person we're talking about. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
All of this is going to get changed by that next episode because Napoleon,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
So in terms of like people who are outside the power structures of the traditional monarchy of like France or Europe.
But I do think it's an interesting question is like we're selecting somebody. Let's assume you select somebody in 1802. The family you bet on may not work out. And you're stuck with that person for life.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's an interesting dynamic, kind of like the Supreme Court, where like once you're on there, society changes, geopolitics change, you're still there.
Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. In our timeline, we did not have an American-born president until Martin Van Buren in 1837. Okay, so we, under our timeline with our system of government, we had the whole, the Monroe Doctrine, just a very I'm not going to say anti-European sentiment, but I mean, pretty much just we didn't want Europe messing with us.
Mm-hmm.
This is essentially a non-democratic America that is way more tied to the hip to Europe and European affairs. And that in turn, I think has just very profound ripple effects that we'll talk about in part 2 on what American foreign policy, American expansionism, that's something I think is going to be interesting to look at in, the future episodes. What does America's expansion west, if it even happens, what does that look like under a Prussian, monarchical model?
Yeah, that was what an excellent transition, Evan. That was very well done because I think we've about covered this sort of setup and sort of how we get to this monarchical America. So I guess we've teased so much foreign policy that we probably don't want to get too much more ahead of ourselves before we can start talking about what all that's going to do. Does anybody have any more last final thoughts as we sort of draw our weird alternate history civics lesson to a close here?
I do have one really, really, I was coming in with
Swear to
something.
God, if you bring up Bass Pro Shop again.
Actually, there isn't one at this one. So there's a little town outside of where the Constitutional Convention is held, up the Schuylkill River, called King of Prussia.
I thought about that in preparation of this episode. I thought about that town.
And it does it. If you know anybody from the east, northeast coast, whatever, what is King of Prussia famous for? It has a gigantic shopping mall there. So no
Next location for Bass Pro Shops.
They do not have a Bass Pro Shop there, but yeah, just I had to throw that in.
I was just thinking there's a lot of Germans in Minnesota, and the Mall of America's up there.
Exactly. I mean, there is something to be said for like thinking about Theodor Steen Veblen and like the Protestant work ethic and all of these other things. Yeah, there's something to be said there.
Yeah. And I think the last thing I'm going to throw out here before we close things off is we didn't really touch on this too much, but I think just kind of took for granted or assumed that all of the 13 colonies were going to play nice with this. They're all going to be cool with this.
That's another thing that I because I think it's going to be in our foreign policy discussion, because that's going to be just like how we're going to be playing with European powers. They're going to be messing with us much more, I think, which is going to
so having them try to set, pit states against states or whatever as a possibility. That's something we'll explore in the future too. But I'm just going to throw this out there at the very end of the episode. I'll say I do not think all of the states would have gone along with this.
No,
I personally feel like the South, which was more, agrarian, less central government authority power, I think there would have been a little bit more wrangling about this. But I think for our future discussion, our future episode, let's just assume that all gets sorted out in an amicable or at least just Shays Rebellion level sort of way.
Like, we kept the legislative branch the same, where a lot of the power is concentrated. The South does benefit from that because
I think
they
would have appreciated that for sure. So that probably would have quelled any sort of.
I think it's interesting to at least mention when we talk about it again, just to at least figure out exactly how that would have played out. Yeah. But good discussion, guys.
Great talk.
Thanks to everyone for listening in. Again, if you have any feedback, or if you want to suggest any more alternate history topics for us, feel free to give us a shout out in the Discord. Leave us a like and review on your favorite podcast player of choice. And until next time, if you see a fork in time, what should we do, gentlemen?
Take it.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.